There are going to be a lot of words between here and the end of this story. That's the point. Stay with it. This is the story of how a man walked into one of the most security-saturated private events in Midtown Manhattan, removed a document from a sealed suite on the 34th floor of a hotel where 11 armed professionals were paid specifically to prevent that from happening, and walked back out through the service entrance while the gala was still in full swing 2 floors below. The security team spent 3 days reviewing footage. They found him in exactly 2 frames. In both, he was carrying a cable reel and looking at his phone. The man who lost the document had been warned. He received the notice 3 days before the event, written by hand on cardstock that cost more per sheet than most people spend on lunch. He read it, made a joke about it to the colleague standing next to him, and handed it to his security director with the same energy he'd used to pass along a dinner reservation. He was not a careless man. He was a man who had never, in 31 years of operating at the level he operated at, encountered a situation he couldn't contain. That track record was real. It was also the most dangerous thing about him. His name was Everett Sinclair. And if you've ever wondered what it looks like when a person is so certain of their own protection that the warning itself becomes invisible, this is that story. If you think you already know where this is going, stay anyway. Because the part that will stay with you isn't the theft. It's the moment Sinclair opened that suite and understood in full what had happened to him. That moment is coming. Everything between here and there is the machinery that made it possible. The gentleman had one rule about announcements. They weren't theater. They were a tool. Every time he told a target what was coming, he was doing something specific. He was engineering their response. And their response, almost without exception, was the plan. He had been watching Everett Sinclair for 4 months before the card was written. Not continuously, not obsessively, but with the kind of attention a person develops when they understand that the only way to move through a system is to understand it better than the people who built it. He had learned Sinclair's patterns the way a structural engineer learns a building, not by looking at the facade, but by studying the load-bearing walls. What he found after 4 months was a man of considerable intelligence operating inside a complete absence of imagination. Sinclair could read a balance sheet with the precision of a surgeon. He could anticipate market behavior, predict regulatory responses, navigate the interior politics of a boardroom with the ease of someone who had been doing it since before most people in the room had finished their MBAs. He was not in any conventional sense a fool. But there was one specific category of human behavior that Everett Sinclair had never fully developed the capacity to model: the behavior of someone who had nothing to lose and no interest in the rules Sinclair had spent his career perfecting. That gap was the door. If you've ever sat across from someone who was completely certain they had you figured out, if you've ever watched a person's confidence function as a blindfold, then you already understand something essential about this story. The question is, what you did with that understanding. Did you walk away, or did you stay in the room? Leave a comment. The gentleman would want to know. Subscribe if you want the rest of what's coming. Not because you have to, because the next story is already in motion, and it starts the same way this one does, with someone being told exactly what's about to happen to them. The document that Everett Sinclair kept in his suite on the 34th floor of the Midtown Grand was not the most valuable thing he owned in any conventional financial sense. He had properties, accounts, positions in funds that dwarfed its market value, which was approximately zero. A piece of paper has no intrinsic worth. What Sinclair understood, what he had understood, since the day he decided to keep the original instead of destroying it with everything else, was that the value of a document is not in the paper. It's in what the paper proves. The settlement had been executed in November of 2019. The underlying case was a pension fund litigation brought by a coalition of retired workers from 3 manufacturing facilities in Ohio and western Pennsylvania. Plants that had been acquired in a leveraged buyout by a private equity vehicle Sinclair controlled through 2 layers of holding companies, restructured over 18 months, and ultimately sold to a strategic buyer in a transaction that generated a return of 412% for Sinclair's fund and left the pension obligations sitting in a bankruptcy estate that paid out 11 cents on the dollar. 4,300 people who had worked 30 years toward a retirement that evaporated in a filing date got a check that wouldn't cover a month of groceries. The litigation that followed was competent. The attorneys were good. They found documents in the discovery process that pointed toward a specific set of internal communications, emails, meeting summaries, one memo in particular, that suggested the decision to underfund the pension escrow during the acquisition had not been an oversight, but a deliberate structuring choice made with full knowledge of the outcome it would produce for the retirees. That memo was never entered into evidence. It was subject to a privilege claim that the presiding judge, in a ruling that 3 appellate attorneys later described privately as creative, upheld. The case settled for a number that Sinclair's fund absorbed as a rounding error. The retirees signed releases. The attorneys moved on. What they didn't know, what nobody except Sinclair and his outside counsel at the time knew, was that the settlement agreement itself contained a paragraph, buried in the indemnification provisions, that acknowledged the existence of the communications that had been withheld. Not their content, not their conclusions, but their existence. A single sentence, drafted by Sinclair's own attorneys in a moment of what could charitably be called imprecision, that used language specific enough to constitute an implicit acknowledgement that responsive documents had been identified and not produced. Sinclair had kept the original because it was insurance, against his partners, against his outside counsel, who were now senior partners at a firm that had gone on to represent 2 of his competitors, against anyone who ever tried to reopen the matter, because if they came for him, he could point to the settlement as proof of resolution, and if they got too close to the buried memo, he could use the settlement's own language to negotiate the terms of whatever came next. It was leverage in both directions simultaneously. The man understood documents the way some people understand music, structurally, instinctively, with an ear for what a single misplaced note could do to an entire composition. He kept it in a fireproof document safe bolted to the floor of the closet in the suite he maintained on the 34th floor of the Midtown Grand. A suite he kept on a permanent reservation at a rate that would have been shocking to anyone who had never spent time in the world where such arrangements are. Unremarkable. The hotel's security infrastructure was one of the reasons he used it for anything sensitive. The other reason was that the building's management had, over 7 years of his residency, developed the particular attentiveness to his preferences that comes from a long and lucrative relationship. He was not a guest. He was a principal. The Gala had been on the calendar since February. It was a fundraiser for a children's hospital foundation that Sinclair had chaired for 4 years, a role that served purposes both genuine and practical, in the proportions that such roles usually serve in that stratum of New York society. The event occupied 2 floors of the hotel, the ballroom on the 32nd floor for dinner and program, the cocktail terrace on the 33rd for the reception. The 34th floor was closed to all gala traffic. The elevator required a code that changed every 72 hours. The code for the night of the gala had been generated and distributed to exactly 4 people: Sinclair, his personal assistant, his head of security, and the hotel's general manager. When the handwritten card arrived at Sinclair's office on the Tuesday before the Saturday event, his head of security, a former federal agent named Douglas Garrett who had spent 11 years doing protective work before moving to the private sector, read it twice, asked 2 questions, and immediately began a reassessment of the event's security architecture. Garrett was not the kind of man who dismissed written threats from unknown sources. He was also not the kind of man who panicked. What he did was methodical, and what he concluded after 2 days of reassessment was that the suite on the 34th floor was already as secure as it was possible to make it, that the gala's existing protocols were robust, and that the most productive response to the threat was to treat it as an opportunity to identify and observe anyone in the building's ecosystem who hadn't been there before. On Thursday morning, Garrett added one additional layer: a secondary biometric access control on the suite's interior closet. The device required installation by a licensed contractor authorized to work on the hotel's security systems. The contractor arrived Thursday afternoon. He was on the hotel's approved vendor list. His credentials were in order. He had done work in the building twice before and was known to the facilities team. He worked quietly, finished in 2 hours, tested the system, briefed Garrett on the override procedure, and left through the service entrance on the ground floor. Garrett reviewed his work personally. It was clean. The closet was now protected by a device that required a fingerprint registered specifically to Sinclair himself. No override existed except through the manufacturer's technical support line, which required a confirmed identity check and a minimum 4-hour response window. Garrett had asked about that window specifically. 4 hours was acceptable. The gala ran from 7 to 11. If anything happened during those 4 hours that required the override, Sinclair would be 2 floors below and available within minutes. Garrett filed the updated security brief with Sinclair on Friday morning. Sinclair read it, asked one question about the biometric device's error rate, received a satisfactory answer, and went back to reviewing remarks he was scheduled to deliver at the gala. He told his assistant to have the card that had arrived Tuesday framed, as a joke, for his office wall. He had already decided it was nothing. He had made the only mistake that a man of his intelligence was capable of making. He had decided too early that he understood the situation. The gentleman had been in the building since Thursday. Not continuously. He had a room on the 22nd floor booked under a name associated with a production company that handled audio and lighting contracts for events at the hotel. The room was a staging point, nothing more. He had checked in Wednesday evening, used the stairs rather than the elevator for his first 3 trips through the building, and spent Thursday morning walking every accessible floor with the particular quality of attention that looks, to anyone observing it, like mild professional boredom. A man with a lanyard checking cable runs. Nobody watched him carefully because there was no reason to. He wasn't on any list of people to watch. He was on the list of people who were supposed to be there. The audio contract was real, in the sense that the production company existed, had a genuine relationship with the hotel's events department, and had been retained for the gala's sound installation several weeks earlier. That retention had come through a referral from a contact in the events industry that the gentleman had cultivated over a period of months without the contact being aware of the cultivation. It was the kind of move that looks, in retrospect, like a long game. In the moment it was being constructed, It had looked like a series of unremarkable professional courtesies. What Garrett had done, adding the secondary biometric lock on Thursday afternoon, was not a surprise. The gentleman had considered it among the 3 most likely responses to the card. The other 2 were a full security audit that would have required him to vary his approach, and a decision to move the document off-site before the gala, which would have required a completely different operation. When Garrett ordered the biometric installation, and when the facilities team called the approved contractor from the vendor list to perform it, the gentleman understood within 40 minutes that the response had landed on the option he had prepared for. The contractor who arrived Thursday afternoon to install the device was licensed, credentialed, on the approved vendor list, and known to the facilities team. All of that was accurate. None of it was the whole story. The whole story was the kind that gets left in the spaces between what can be verified and what actually happened, and the gentleman had no interest in filling those spaces in. Not for anyone, not even here. What can be said is that the device was installed correctly. It functioned exactly as Garrett had been briefed. Sinclair's fingerprint was registered. The override procedure was accurately described. Every technical specification was met, and by the time Garrett reviewed the installation on Friday morning and found it clean, one thing was different from what he believed it to be. One thing. The difference was not visible. It was not in the hardware. It was not in the firmware. It was in something that Garrett had not thought to check, because it had not existed as a category of thing to check, not in his experience, not in any protocol he had been trained on. That is where the method stays. That is where it will always stay. The gentleman spent Friday afternoon in his room on the 22nd floor reading a paperback novel and ordering room service twice. He slept 8 hours. On Saturday morning, he was in the ballroom by 7:15, running a final check on the sound system with 2 other members of the production crew, both of whom knew him as a contractor they had worked with twice and found competent and quiet. He ate lunch in the staff area on the 2nd floor. He watched Garrett walk the 34th floor corridor at 2:15 and again at 4. He noted the pattern with the same quality of attention he'd given everything else. Filed it. Moved on. The gala began at 7. By 7:40, the ballroom held 312 people. The cocktail terrace above it held another 90. Sinclair had delivered his remarks at 7:20 and received the kind of applause that greets a man in his position at events he has organized and funded, and that exist, in some structural sense, at his pleasure. He was at table 4 with 6 other people, visible, engaged, not going anywhere. Garrett was positioned near the ballroom entrance, cycling his team through the building on 30-minute rotations. The gentleman was on the 34th floor at 7:52. He had used the service elevator, which required a key card, which he had, and which had been logged as being used by a member of the audio production team checking a cable run to the broadcast booth on 35. The log was accurate. There was a cable run to 35. He checked it. He was on camera for 11 seconds on the 35th floor near the broadcast booth with his cable reel and his phone. He looked bored. He always looked bored in buildings with cameras. It was a decision, not a mood. The 34th floor corridor was empty when he stepped off the elevator. Garrett's 4 o'clock walk had been the last scheduled sweep before the event ended. The next was at 10. He had 2 hours and 8 minutes, which was approximately 2 hours more than he needed. The suite door opened. What happened inside the suite in the next 11 minutes is described here only in its results, because the results are the story, and the mechanism is not. The safe was opened, the document was removed. A photocopy of the first page was placed inside the safe, which was then closed. The copy had been prepared 4 days earlier. On it, in red ink, a specific red, the color of the ink Sinclair used on documents he was marking for his own review, a color the gentleman had identified through observation and confirmed through a contact. A single sentence was underlined. The sentence read, in the language of the settlement agreement's indemnification provision, that the parties had reached their resolution voluntarily and with full knowledge of all material facts available to them at the time of execution. The word voluntarily had a line under it. Clean, even, the kind of line a person draws with a ruler. The safe was relocked. The suite was as he had found it. He was back in the service elevator at 8:03. He was in the staff area on the second floor at 8:07, returning his equipment to the production company's staging area. He was outside the building at 8:20, which was while the Gala's auction segment was underway, and the room was loud and focused on a lot number being called from the podium. Nobody stopped him. Nobody looked at him. Nobody had any reason to. Douglas Garrett found out something was wrong at 10:47 when he accompanied Sinclair to the suite at the end of the evening, and Sinclair opened the safe to confirm the document was present, as was his habit at the end of any event in that building. The habit was automatic, like checking a wallet. He had done it 40 or 50 times without incident. When he opened the safe and found the photocopy, he stood for approximately 4 seconds without moving. Garrett, standing 2 feet behind him, saw the change in his posture before he saw what was in the safe. Sinclair picked up the photocopy. He held it for a long moment. His face did not collapse. He was not that kind of man. What happened was subtler and, in its way, more total. A quality of stillness that arrived in his expression like weather, displacing everything that had been there before it. He read the underlined sentence twice. He set the copy down on the shelf inside the safe. He closed the safe door. He turned around. He looked at Garrett for a moment before speaking. "Review the footage," he said. "Overnight. Everything." Garrett reviewed it. His team reviewed it. They found the gentleman in 2 frames. Once at the service elevator on the 35th floor at 7:58. Once in the staff area on the 2nd floor at 8:07. In both frames, he was carrying a cable reel and looking at his phone. In neither frame was he on the 34th floor. In neither frame was he anywhere near the suite. In neither frame was he doing anything that constituted evidence of anything. Garrett brought in a firm that specialized in security consulting for high-value events. They spent 2 days going through the building's systems. They confirmed what Garrett had already suspected. The biometric lock had not been bypassed. It had been operated correctly, with the registered fingerprint, at the only moment it had been opened between the installation on Thursday afternoon and Sinclair's use of it Saturday night. The log showed one entry. The registered user. Everything clean. The firm's lead consultant, a woman named Patricia Novak, who had 20 years in the field and had consulted on 3 federal investigations, told Garrett privately that she had reviewed the installation record for the biometric device and found nothing anomalous. She used the word nothing with the particular emphasis of someone who has spent a career finding things and is accustomed to finding something. She said it twice. Sinclair did not go to the police. This will surprise no one who understands what the document was. Reporting its theft required explaining what it was, why he had it, and what its contents meant. Reporting the theft meant handing the other side, the retiree's attorneys, any journalist with a source in the NYPD, anyone with a reason to look, the first thread of a story that had been closed for 5 years. The document's value to Sinclair had always depended on its secrecy. The moment it was in the open, the insurance it represented inverted. It became a liability instead of a weapon. He called his outside counsel. He told them what had been taken. There was a long silence on the phone, of the kind that costs $400 a minute, and then his attorney said very carefully that they should probably talk about this in person. Sinclair agreed. The meeting was scheduled for Monday. He arrived, and his attorney arrived, and they talked for 2 hours. And at the end of it, nothing had changed, except that 2 more people in the world now knew that Everett Sinclair had kept a document he should have destroyed, and that it was gone. He never found out who took it. He never found out how it was done. He spent a considerable amount of money over the following year in an effort to answer both questions. The money was spent on competent people who returned competent work that added up to nothing actionable. The biometric log showed one entry. The security footage showed a cable technician looking at his phone. The approved contractor's records were clean, nothing connected to anything. Somewhere in the same city, in the weeks after the gala, a woman named Denise Okafor received a call from an attorney she had never heard of, representing a legal foundation that she had also never heard of, informing her that a matter she had believed closed for 5 years had come to their attention through a document they were not yet prepared to disclose, and that, if she was willing, they would like to discuss whether there were grounds to revisit certain claims that the 2019 settlement had released. Denise had worked 31 years at the Youngstown facility. She had been 62 when the bankruptcy wiped out her pension. She had gone back to work as a pharmacy technician and was still working that job 4 years later, not because she particularly wanted to, but because the numbers required it. When she received the call, she was on her lunch break, sitting in her car in the pharmacy parking lot, eating a sandwich she had packed from home. She listened to the attorney for 4 minutes without saying anything. Then she asked one question. "Is this real?" she said. The attorney told her it was. She sat in her car for a while after the call ended. She didn't finish the sandwich. She called her daughter, who was at work and couldn't talk long, and told her what had just happened. Her daughter said, "Mom," in a way that carried several things at once. Denise Okafor did not know who had made the call possible. She never would. The gentleman had no interest in her knowing, no interest in credit, no interest in the particular kind of gratitude that comes from being identified as the source of a gift. What he had was the document, and what the document was worth was not what it would have been worth to Sinclair, but what it could be worth to an attorney who understood what the settlement's own language admitted, and who had the time and the motivation to build something out of it. The attorney he had found, through means that also stay here, had both. The legal process that followed was slow, complicated, and not guaranteed. It was a thread, not a resolution. The gentleman understood the difference. What he had done was not provide justice. He didn't have that kind of power, and anyone who claims that kind of power is selling something. What he had done was restore a variable that the system had removed. The retiree's attorneys had been working with a settled case and no evidence. They now had something different. What they built with it was up to them and the courts and the long, grinding machinery of a process that had failed these people once already and might fail them again. He thought about that in the weeks after the gala. He thought about it without illusion, which is the only productive way to think about systems that exist at that scale. The system had not been fixed. One man had been outplayed, and one document had moved from a safe in a midtown hotel to a filing that might, in 2 or 3 years, result in something that resembled accountability. Sinclair still had his properties, and his accounts, and his positions. He still had his name on the hospital foundation's annual report. He was still a man who had won 31 years of a game built for people like him. But there was a photocopy in his safe with a word underlined in red. And every time he opened that safe, which he still did, out of habit, though there was no longer anything in it worth checking on, he saw it. He had decided not to remove it. He wasn't sure why exactly. Maybe because removing it would require acknowledging, in some physical sense, what it signified. Maybe because its presence was a record that he felt, on some level he wouldn't have named aloud, he deserved to keep. That was his choice. The gentleman hadn't made it for him. He had just made sure the choice was available. There was a member of the production crew named Lupin, who had worked with the gentleman on the Gala setup and who, in the course of 2 days of shared work, had told him, not at length, just in the way that people fill silences in the middle of physical labor, that he had a daughter starting college in the fall and that the scholarship she'd been counting on had come through short and that the gap was manageable but not comfortable. He hadn't been complaining. He'd been filling silence. The gentleman had listened in the way he always listened, fully, without appearing to. 2 weeks after the gala, Lou received a notification from the Scholarship Foundation that an anonymous supplemental grant had been made to his daughter's award. The amount was not large. It covered the gap. There was no explanation attached, no name, no note. Lou mentioned it to his wife, who suggested maybe the foundation had found additional funds. Lou accepted that explanation because it was the available one. He was not a man inclined to question good news when it arrived. The gentleman had no theory about why he did things like that. He didn't think it canceled anything out, didn't think it earned him a score he could consult when the ledger came due. He had heard someone once get very serious about the question of whether a person could be genuinely good if they operated outside the law, and he had thought without saying it that the question was designed for people who wanted a clean answer rather than a true one. He didn't have a clean answer. He had a code, and the code was his, and he hadn't inherited it from anywhere, and didn't feel the need to defend it to anyone who hadn't walked the same ground. What he had when he thought about the gala and the document and Denise Okafor on her lunch break in a pharmacy parking lot in Youngstown, what he had was something that didn't have a precise name in the vocabulary of either law or morality, the two languages most people use when they try to talk about these things. It was something quieter than satisfaction and more durable than relief. It was the particular feeling of a man who had said he would do something and had done it exactly, and who was now finished with it, and who knew the difference between finished and resolved, and who was at peace with that difference. The card he had sent Sinclair, the one Sinclair had joked about framing, was never framed. Sinclair's assistant had put it in a drawer in the outer office. After the gala, it was moved without ceremony to a file that nobody opened again. The handwritten card with the hotel's name embossed at the top and the 6 lines of text telling Everett Sinclair exactly what was going to happen to him. Filed in a drawer, in an office, in a building in Midtown Manhattan, where it would stay until someone decided it was no longer worth keeping. The gentleman hadn't signed it. He never did. You stayed to the end, which means you already know what this story was really about. It wasn't about the safe or the biometric lock or the footage from the 34th floor that showed nothing. It was about what happens when a man who has operated for 3 decades inside a system built around his specific brand of intelligence encounters someone who is not playing the same game and was never planning to. Sinclair's certainty was genuine. It came from evidence. 31 years of evidence, every piece of it pointing in the same direction. He had been right every time. In every room, against every adversary who had ever tried to come at him directly or indirectly, or through the legal mechanisms that he navigated with the ease of a native speaker. He had earned his certainty. That is what made it lethal. The gentleman didn't beat Everett Sinclair because he was smarter. He beat him because he understood something Sinclair had never needed to understand: that the rules of a game are only binding for people who have agreed to play. Sinclair had spent his career mastering a game. The gentleman had spent his career deciding which games were worth entering and on what terms. There's a difference between a locked room and a safe situation. A locked room is a construction. A safe situation is a belief. Sinclair had one of each, and he confused them. The word on the photocopy was voluntarily. The choice of that word was not arbitrary. It was the specific language in the settlement that acknowledged the most. Not a word Sinclair had been forced to sign, but a word he had agreed to, because at the time he had believed it protected him. It did protect him, right up until it didn't. If you've sat through this whole story, one question has probably been forming at the back of your mind. Not about what happened, but about what it means. So here it is, direct. Is there a difference between what the law protects and what justice requires? Not as a philosophy question. In practice, in the actual world where settlements get filed and documents get buried, and people go back to work at 62 because the numbers require it, where does your answer land? If the story stayed with you, leave it in the comments. Not for the gentleman. He doesn't read comments. For everyone else who watched this to the end and is sitting with the same question you are. Like the video if the story was worth your time. Subscribe if you want to be in the room the next time an impossible promise gets kept. The gentleman is already watching something. He's already 3 moves into the next problem. He hasn't written the card yet, but he will.